I want to introduce Mary Preus, who is going to be speaking to us about worship, something about which she is eminently qualified. She works, as some of you know, at Our Savior's Lutheran Church, which was the parent congregation for Woodlake and I think other congregations out here. And also she works as one of the worship teachers at the seminary, correct? Plus she sang at our wedding, so that's the most important thing. So I'll let Mary talk from now on and hand it over to her.
Great. So, as Diane said, it was my honor to sing at Diane and John's wedding, mostly because John and I had played music together before. And although I am in the crowd of the beautiful white-haired people in the Lutheran church, I come from a Norwegian Lutheran background of Lutheran pastors. I myself have had a sort of a varied church background. I grew up, of course, in a pastor's home in North Dakota, in the Lutheran church in the old ALC. But as soon as I turned 16, I just left the church. And I didn't come back until I was about 35 years old. So I had a big, long gap in there where I did sort of the classic away from church, experimental, no church. I became Baha'i, and then I worshiped with Quakers, and I ended up in the UCC church back here in Minneapolis. And then with a lot of arm twisting, Pastor Don Rudrud, who was at Our Savior's at the time, said to me, "You should be the music director here." And I said, "No, I don't think so," and left. And if you know Don at all, he's very persuasive. And he just never gave up. He just said to me, "I think this is a calling for you." And that was 20 years ago. And he, along with Janet Tiedemann, who was co-pastor there at the time, were very persuasive in getting me there. I tell you that partly because you realize sometimes that the way we are called into our various ministries in life can sometimes be kind of kicking and screaming. And that you can sometimes be the instigator of helping someone else know what it is, where they belong, and what they're good at, and what might really enliven their life and the lives of those around them. So that is where I ended up. I'm also the worship coordinator for an ecumenical community, the community of St. Martin. Some of you might remember St. Martin's Table, a restaurant and bookstore that was up in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood in Minneapolis. That's since closed, sadly enough. But the worshiping community that was affiliated with that enterprise still goes on. And we meet on Sunday evenings along with Franz Meyer's daughter, Karen, my good friend and sister in Christ in the community of St. Martin. Along with several other families, we meet weekly on Sunday evenings. We have no ordained minister representing that church, but it's totally lay-led evening prayer service and mutual support group for neighbors. I'm also at the seminary, like Diane said, and what I've been doing is assisting in the worship class there, being the voice of practice, so that if the professors there are telling the history of worship, and then a student says, "Yes, but how do I do that in my congregation?" they look at me and say, "Mary, why don't you help them?" Because as we know, the study of worship and liturgy and the understanding of our tradition, our rich, varied, beautiful tradition, is one thing. And then it's another thing to actually be in a congregation and apply that knowledge and encounter the challenges and the blessings and joys that you do within a congregation. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'm hoping that you will help me know a little bit more about you. And I'm going to drive our videographer crazy because first of all, I like to move around a lot. And now I'm going to ask all of you to move around with down the middle of this open space from the coffee to the brick wall, a continuum of our bodies. And you're going to choose where you want to be on the continuum. Okay? You don't have to firmly decide exactly that you agree or disagree with the two statements I'm going to make. One's going to be on one extreme and one on the other. But pick a place on that line where you could make a comment about worship. That's what we're going to do this on. And I'm going to just do a couple of these as quickly as we can move into this state. So first I'll tell you what the ends are. By the brick wall, it's going to say, "I'd like worship to be comforting and familiar." That's that end of our continuum. By the coffee over here is going to be, I'd like worship to be surprising and challenging. So the brick wall is comforting and familiar, and over by coffee is surprising and challenging. If you are willing and able, please take a spot right here on this line.
Everybody's in the middle.
Well, because I like the wall.
Here we go. We'll just get real close.
I have to be wherever you are because I have to. Okay, everybody, I had a suspicion that this would happen. A ginormous clump. And would someone from the clump in the middle say why you're there?
Because I just like a little bit of, I don't like it to be the same all the time because, you know, and I like to have some new surprises. I like a little bit of both.
Anybody else from the middle have another comment, or is it mostly for that reason that you'd like to see a
But the
little
old
bit?
and familiar is very comforting. It is. You want a little bit of both. Yep. Yes.
All right. Let's go to familiar and comforting. What do you have to say about being down here?
There wasn't any room in the middle.
Oh, there's room. Well, someone who actually chose being over there then.
It's reverent.
It feels more reverent to
Yes.
you to be familiar, something that's familiar and comforting. It also feels reverent, okay? So that's an interesting question because do you feel like you people in the middle would want worship to be reverent?
Yeah. Yes.
Right, so,
in the middle.
okay, good. Someone else from this end, another reason why you're down here?
I'll really set them off. It's very orthodox.
Ah, okay, it seems more orthodox to you to do familiar and comforting.
We don't have to work so hard.
You don't have to work so hard because you already know what you're doing. That's true.
We don't like change.
You don't. And that's good to admit. That's right. Don't like change. Why?
Because there's all these other things we mentioned, comforting and
It's not as comforting to change. All right, let's hear from the change end. Anybody?
Yeah, I'm totally opposite. I'm competitive and I like something new. I don't like rote.
Yeah.
That's,
And why is that?
the traditional thing becomes routine and, for me, I'm just there. I don't really feel I know why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, okay. And for some of us, I'd have to say that while we might still like comfort and we might still believe in some tradition, rote can become numbing a little bit and not, being a person who believes a little bit more that way myself.
I think our, our liturgies and the more familiar hymns are so full of wonderful ideas and inspiration, but I think because it is rote, we tend to lose that.
There you go.
I know when we sing "This is the Feast," I remember wanting to yell at the choir, "Smile! This is the feast!"
All right, good. Yes,
I
in the
think,
middle.
with trying new things, you see more of the old global picture of Christianity.
Trying new things gives you a bigger picture of who the body of Christ is all around the world. Yeah.
Without new and different and change, you really don't grow.
Well,
You gotta look forward.
you don't feel like you're growing if you're not having some change and some challenge. Okay, this is great. Wonderful. Stay there because now you
But
won't.
just a minute, Mary, I
Yeah.
also want, just because I'm down here doesn't mean I don't like things to change at all,
Uh-huh.
but it's just that I'd like them to be reverent.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, that's a
So-
different continuum though, about reverence versus liveliness.
Okay,
or something
I'll
like
wait my
that.
turn then.
Yeah, okay. No, that's a good clarification. That's really good. All right, now you're probably going to move, right? But you're still standing. All right. At Woodlake Lutheran, we use a wide variety of worship resources. We're going to put those people by the brick wall. If you believe this to be true, at Woodlake Lutheran Church, we use a wide variety of resources. You go to the brick wall. Over by the coffee, we're going to say, at Woodlake Lutheran Church, we've been basically doing the same thing since I've been here. So, wide variety of resources, if that's what you believe, or have come to understand. And if you think it's basically you're doing what you've always been doing, that would be down here.
Except for doing
which relative to the spectrum is a short period of time.
Yes, good point. Right here in this section, what would you say about why you're here? You talking to me?
I'm an older member of the congregation, and I, of all of my years of church attendance, it's always been the same basic format. At my age, I am it's a little hard for me to all of a sudden go from day to night and make a complete change. The gradual change, I'm okay with, and I think we're doing some of that right now. We're staying with some of the old, but putting in a little bit of the new, and I'm okay with that. But a total changeover, I don't know that I could accept that.
Aha. So down here at this end, yes.
Well, we're Lutheran in heritage, and I hope we stay that way. And certain things I think we can expect that differentiate Lutherans from perhaps some other Protestants. And that is a liturgy that reflects certain things. I think you know what I mean. And we do it in the traditional service that we used to have at 8:45. We do it at 10 o'clock, and we do it with a wonderful blended service now at 10 o'clock. As long as we've got we're getting the same things that we've done as traditional Lutherans.
I guess I feel we've lost the reverence in the traditional since we've combined the services. I don't feel it's as reverent, in my opinion. I feel some of that has been lost since they've combined it.
All right, Dick.
I, on the other side, like the variety of, like meeting with younger people, and I think that's been a real inspiration to me, and I like to hear kids crying and moving around. We didn't have that so much before when we had two services.
They need change just like we do.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, then here's the last one, and then we're just going to see what you look like on this last one, and then we'll sit down again. Down by the coffee, it's, I want a worship life that always includes word and sacrament done with integrity and dignity.
Gotta move.
I figured that. Going from one end to the
Gotta
other.
move. It's not the only one.
And down here is going to be, I like a worship that feels more casual, where we use more original resources.
Geez, I'm just.
Original
Original like by yourself.
I've moved all of 6 feet.
I know.
Well, but I think it's important to notice that the vocal people are in the middle on all of these, so that's the thing about dictating to either end of the extreme.
All right, down here. Let's have this end speak first.
I find that some of my most meaningful worship experiences have been in a more casual setting.
Can you see why that might have been, or what was it about that?
I think it's that same old rote thing that you become so used to going up for communion or being part of the service here that sometimes your mind isn't engaged. But if you're in a new setting and experiencing it in a whole different way, your mind doesn't drift away. You're very focused on what's happening.
So that doesn't sound so much like it was because it was casual, it was because it was different than what you normally would do.
Correct, but it's always been in a casual setting when
Yeah.
I've experienced that.
Okay,
so,
good, yeah.
Well, no, that's not true, because I go to the Catholic Church with my husband's family, where it is it's a different experience, and it's the casualness that engages me versus the formalness, I guess.
Yeah.
Would you read this one again first, please?
This one says, I want worship to feel more casual using original resources. I'm sorry, that's you. I want a worship life that always includes word and sacrament done with integrity and dignity.
It seems to me that can be done.
Yeah, not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. No, well, that's the nature of a continuum, and that's why so many of you are in the middle. Because you believe that you can have integrity and dignity with a variety of worship styles. Is that what you'd say in the middle?
Yes.
Okay.
And even if I were further toward that end, I would
Which you
say
should
the
be.
same thing.
Anybody else in the middle? Is that, I saw a lot of
that what you're thinking, is that you still want dignity, or you still want reverence?
And I
you
think
still
this is
want-
how we're all understanding the words as well, because I understand maybe reverence. We've talked about that in our worship planning things, how people can interpret words differently. I always bring my kids into this because that's where we're at in our lives. And one thing that they have said when Jacqueline and Lauren have come home from college and they've come to services recently, is that I feel more able to just open up because I don't feel that things are too, but that's a younger view of, so whether we call it reverent, or sometimes people think that is formal or stuffy, when reverence is not, that's not what many people think reverence is, so I think.
So in some ways you could call this formal as opposed to casual, and that might be a better continuum. Because reverence could be included in all points of the
Right,
continuum.
everything.
Yes.
Right.
And I think you said with your kids, they're younger in their perspective, but part of the reason I'm down here is one of my son-in-laws was never in the church. And this is what I feel will keep he and his family involved.
That's true. And any of the formal people want to speak to being more formal, or word and sacrament is how I listed it before, with integrity?
You said word and sacrament.
So you're going to say it's more orthodox,
Yes.
you're going to say it's going to be a more traditional Lutheran Orthodox.
I grew up in the UCC church as well, and I wasn't used to parades and the formal stuff, and I liked the informal stuff. My father used to ask for comments from the congregation, and I think I like that, and I like the fact that we have people, families that lead the worship in our church. I think that was very, very good. Before, we had none of that.
And you like that because?
I like that because it's less formal and it's more warm feeling to me.
Okay, it has a warmer feel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, can I just say this? I think you can want the word and sacrament, and you can still have what you're saying, because I like a lot of what we're doing now too, that is more informal. But we need the word and sacrament.
Yeah.
You can come home now.
Anyone else you want to say something?
In this particular one, where would you be?
I'd probably be in the middle too, saying that I don't really care actually what style the worship is that I am either part of or am leading, but that I think there needs to be care given to the worship itself, and warmth, and all of the other qualities. And let's talk about that now. Let's get back to our seats, and we'll talk about that for a little bit. There's a former worship book, of course, that some of you recognize, the Lutheran Book of Worship, or LBW. And in the front of all of these hymnals, at the very, very beginning, are a couple of little pages that are called the introduction. And I've never looked at these in my life until I was part of helping put together this latest book. So in the LBW, the opening paragraph says, corporate worship expresses the unity of the people of God and their continuity with Christians across the ages. In the liturgical traditions are the gestures, songs, and words by which Christians have identified themselves and others. Later in the introduction, which is only 2 full pages really, it says here, the services of the Lutheran Book of Worship embody the tradition of worship which received its characteristic shape during the early centuries of the Church's existence and was reaffirmed during the Reformation era. Later on in that paragraph it says that, to me, the key sentence of this whole introduction that just jumped out at me when I first read through it. Freedom and flexibility in worship is a Lutheran inheritance. And there is room for ample variety in ceremony, music, and liturgical form. So now, since you have a few around you, open up the introduction to the ELW. That's the very first thing. On page 6, 7, and 8.
Can't read the print.
So all we're looking very briefly is at page 8. The second full paragraph down says, Evangelical Lutheran worship, which is what we're calling this new book, ELW, continues to emphasize that freedom and flexibility in worship is a Lutheran inheritance, and there is room for ample variety in ceremony, music, and liturgical form, as just quoted out of the LBW. And
then it goes on to say, and through its design and through a variety of interpretive materials herein, it seeks to make more transparent the principle of fostering unity without imposing uniformity. That was all I wanted to say out of there for now. So I'm just curious about that because I think it was so stunning for me, having grown up in a North Dakota Norwegian Lutheran church, where basically we came into holy, holy, holy every single Sunday of life until I didn't hear the words to that hymn at all. I mean, I could still sing them all the verses, but I don't know that they meant anything to me after a while. And I was one of those people that then just turned off the whole service. I think, as we saw in our continuum, some of that has to do with just learning styles, right? Any of you that are teachers know that each of us is put together in a particular way with our left brain, our right brain, the way our body works, our hormones, and our mind. It has a lot to do with your brain as to the way you absorb things, learn things, do things, practice things, repeat things. So some of us who are more visceral learners, or we need to be either moving or doing something different to keep us awake, have trouble just being in a church that is absolutely still and staid and repetitive. It just becomes a closed door after a while. So you've got people on that continuum all the way from one end to the other. So I was very interested, after having that experience myself, to see that within Lutheran worship, in all of its rich tradition and heritage, freedom and flexibility were so lifted up. Because in my experience, it looked like it was absolutely a rote format that just stuck to the same thing from one week to the next. Now, I'm sure for each one of you, that's been a different trajectory, a different learning in your whole lifetime. But I want to now just uphold the rich tradition that we have inherited in the Lutheran Church. And that you can find in these books one more time on page at the bottom of the page, 92 and 3. One of the lovely things about this new hymnal has been these works of art that are in here. Have you had a chance to look at any of them? There's some just beautiful ones. Right before 92 and 93 is a piece by the Chinese artist He Qi. And this is the Emmaus table, where you see Jesus and the two unnamed disciples eating in their home. And you can also see Jerusalem in the background and the women at the cross that are looking at the empty tomb. And part of the reason that that's there is that if you turn the page, we go to Holy Communion, and it talks about the pattern for worship. Then turn the page again, and you see this pattern that has been in place since probably just after Jesus' life, as the new Christian community gathered. It's not a very formal pattern. It's actually a lot like the pattern in your own home when you have guests for dinner. They come to the door, and you have what you might call gathering. Hi, how was the road? Where did you park? Is everything okay? Come on in. I'll take your coat and we'll put it here in the closet. Then you go into Word. Let's have a seat. Do you want something to drink? Let's chat for a minute. How's everybody? How are the kids? What's happened on your job? How is your mother doing? Etc. Let's sit down at the table. Now it's time for dinner. Everybody's at the table. And then when you're done with your meal, off we go. When am I going to see you again? Here's your coat. Don't forget to turn left at the stop sign. And off you go with your sending ritual. This is not a really formal church pattern. It's actually just a really normal human pattern for almost any ritual that we do. So here it is. Gathering, word, meal, and sending. Now, so sometimes in Lutheran worship, not unlike other Protestant forms of worship, or even Catholic more so, I'd say, if you look at this like a kind of a two-mountain hike you're taking, you know, one of the heights of the hike is the word, one of the peaks of your hike is the meal, and then here we go. And this sending doesn't really stop. This sending really goes out into the world, as you are discovering here at Wood Lake. And the sending doesn't just go this way, it comes back around this way and informs your gathering the next time you're together and wherever you gather together. Where some of you might see each other outside of church and talk about what happened at church, or say, what are we going to do next time once we leave church? So that you can have worship that is meaningful to your life beyond just this Sunday morning or Saturday evening or Wednesday morning, wherever it is that you meet. When you have freedom and flexibility within worship, it's really helpful, I find, to have some kind of basic structure that you're putting the freedom and the flexibility into. And that's where, over the years, even having been a rebel without a cause myself, I see that the rich inheritance of the tradition of worship is something not to be dismissed lightly. If you decide you're not going to have communion in worship, which of course many Lutherans did, depending on what your cultural tradition is over the years. I didn't have communion in every Sunday worship growing up. And most of the Scandinavian churches, well, Norwegians, Norwegians and Swedes have a big difference there.
4 times a year.
There you go. 4 times a year. Too much is too much, right? So, but I think that they had some good arguments with the ancestors, which in this case were Catholics, right? The ancestors to us had been Catholic. And so why were we not going to do communion every week? Part of it was in response or reform or a belief that it was not in the same place of prominence as the Word. Now for many of us that has been reformed once again, and we've said these are the 2 highlights of our worship, Word and Sacrament, and we want to experience this at each time we worship. So the point is that they can be done completely differently in a million different ways. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that transformed me greatly was worshiping in the global church. If you ever have a chance, have any of you ever had a chance to worship in another country or with people from another country here in this country? Because, and I don't know if this is going to resonate with you, but for me it was really helpful because you could see the form, but so many different things took place within it. Either people were dressed differently, or there was incense used, but it was a Lutheran worship, or there was people traveled differently for communion, or used different bread. There were different songs sung, and maybe different musical instruments that were used to accompany congregational singing. And that woke me up to my own tradition and my own pattern of worship. And I thought, here is a very interesting way for us now to share the gifts of the global church, which you've seen in this book too, I think, haven't you? Have you seen any of the songs that come from places around the world that are not familiar to you anymore? There's some new and different things in here. Anybody else have any comments about that global worship that was interesting or that you noticed when you did?
We met in Lutheran church in Jerusalem, and a festival Sunday, I believe it was the Bishop of Sweden that spoke. We sang a hymn in 5 voices, or 5 languages.
Simultaneously?
Yeah.
Yeah, that often happens in global worship, and that's like being in a Pentecost experience right there. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Anybody else? I got to make sure that we're watching our time now. We're going to end at 10, isn't that right?
A little before 10.
A little
The
before
service is
10.
at 10, so.
Oh, that's right.
I'll be out a little.
You'll be
early.
gone.
I'll be gone.
And I have to run because I'm going to go back to my worship at 10:30. So
So I
sorry
would hang
can't
out till about
linger.
5:02 for them, but for
5
me,
to-
I'll sneak out a little earlier.
Okay, good, thanks. I should have got that at the beginning, but
Sure.
now we do have it, so that's wonderful. So if we think about worship in one other way, just while we're on, this is one way to think of it, this kind of mountain way of this pattern of worship. And the richness that you can find in here, this is just sort of the bare bones structure. Another way to think of it, and here's where I wish I was a better drawer, is that what is at the heart of worship? Anybody want to take a stab at it? cross. Or say it differently. Jesus. Or you could say the love of God revealed to us in Jesus. So the cross representing Jesus and the love of God revealed. Okay, so since that's a heart, what you could say about this four-part thing you see in your hymnals there, gathering, word, meal, sending, is you could make that be the skeleton. These are ribs. And here's little collarbones. And I'm not going to mess with the head. Okay. So this is the skeleton of your worship. Gathering, word, meal, sending. I guess it does not apply to any particular bones in particular, but it's not the heart. And that's important to remember, always remembering what the heart of worship is. But the skeleton is this pattern, and it really helps us because it gives us something to hang things on. Okay, then you could start talking about clothing. And that would be things like what worship book you use, how you sit in the pew, whether or not you sing in English or another language, whether or not your worship is accompanied by an organ or a drum, whether or not you have a choir or no choir, children, no children. All these things in some ways are getting farther and farther away from the heart of the matter. And the trouble is where do we spend most of our time arguing about or thinking about in our worship? It's out here on the mittens of worship. It's not even on the skeleton. And so in your worship planning, I think it's a great idea to always have sort of this heart of the matter in front of you. And remember that you're talking about the love of God revealed to us in Jesus, which really doesn't help that much when you're choosing the hymn of the day. I mean, it does, but it's important to remember, and still you have to deal with all the choices that you've got in worship. I want to make sure before we say anything more, because I want to open it up to some questions or concerns from you and make sure that I'm speaking to you in a way that's helpful, that one really, really important thing to know, and I say this standing here looking at all of your beautiful faces, is how blessed you are to be here together. And never to forget that. And then, secondly, how blessed you are with resources, even though sometimes you feel as if you don't have enough. And then, thirdly, I would just like to point out that you are really blessed with good leadership. And that comes both from you, the lay part of the congregation, and from your hired staff. And I just want to also hold up, even though it might be embarrassing for you sitting in this room, your church musician, who I have the pleasure of working with now at the seminary. He is an incredible person to have in a church. You are really richly blessed. Because I go around a lot, and I have seen church musicians around the country, and there are people facing great challenges with their musical resources. And so that could just be, as you may know this from other settings that you've been in, or knowing your friends or family, that can really be a big obstacle. Or ministerial staff that are standing in the way of the future of your church. And you now are looking at people who are really going to be helpful for that. So for your pastors as well, we'll give them a big hand. Now, I think your goal, your job, is to recognize those gifts, and then really, like I said about what Don Rudroot did for me, enable those people to use those gifts as much as they can. Help to give them the power and the authority to really say, you are the congregation, you are the people here, and here's what we could do. One of the things that Zach has going for him, which is amazing as such a young person, is, the talent that you have, Zach, is obvious, but it's not typical for a young person with that kind of talent in the church, I think, to also be open and able to do so many different kinds of styles, and to really be able to see the resources that you have in front of you and think about how those could be best used. So that's something that you should be pushing him on. Okay, I have a lot of other ideas, but I would appreciate your help at the moment. If you can give me any direction. What do you think in the next 10 minutes would be the most helpful to talk about from your setting? As far as worship goes.
Give us some choices.
Okay, give us some choices.
I particularly like the lay participation in the service, which gives a lot of families an opportunity to help lead the service. And because I think our churches are becoming our families. You know, in the rural areas and in the smaller cities, towns and countries in Minnesota and Midwest, most of the families lived there, they were buried there. Today, that's not true. Our families are scattered all over the world.
Right.
And so the churches are social.
Yeah. And so it's partly a way to get to know each other. I mean, if you'll see somebody, you know, why is it, Dick, that you want to see lay participation in worship? Or more lay participation? You already have lay participation, right?
Yeah, I just feel that's our family. The church is our family.
Uh-huh.
And to get together with them is uplifting to me.
Mm-hmm. All right. Other things people would like to anybody want to pop out anything?
We've tried having just a single service on Sunday mornings this year, and I wonder if you can comment on the wisdom of having one or having two different kinds of services.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess I'd like to make the obvious observation that aside from Chris, maybe we're the youngest people here,
Yeah.
and that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, and you realize that that's true for the whole
Yep.
Lutheran church, so it's not unusual. Yes.
I think for me, I've been a member here for nearly 30 years, but I find that a lot of, and I consider myself and my wife to be active in church affairs and doing volunteer work and whatnot, but it seems like that we still have a lack of getting to know members of our congregation well enough. I find out more at funerals about
Yeah.
members than I do coming here on a weekly basis.
Getting to know you. Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes that seems to me it's more appropriate for, not that you can't get to know people within worship. Part of it is by seeing a lot of different faces participating. But those are things that happen a lot of times around worship, right? So that it's important just to make sure you've got those kind of things. And it's not just a funeral, but it's a sing-along or a get-together or a family-oriented event. Was there one more thing? Otherwise, we'll
Comment
pick
about
one.
house churches.
Oh, okay. House churches. Huh. All right. Let's start with one worship. Because I've been in a couple different places that have made this decision in both directions. And one was to go from multiple services to one, and one was to go from one to multiple. I think that the unity of one worship offers you two things. Unity, and it teaches us tolerance and humility. Two, I think, really good qualities for Christians to always be working on. You'll be in worship then with somebody who doesn't agree with you about the style of worship. And then you're going to entrust your worship leaders to be designing a worship service that's going to include many styles so that you're not always uncomfortable. Nobody's always uncomfortable, but you will be uncomfortable at some point. So I think that that's a good thing to foster as a Christian. It's not, your goal in church is not to be made comfortable, period, right? It's not the only thing. Some of you prefer familiarity, and there's nothing wrong with that. That should not be taken away. That's part of our rich and important blessing of our heritage. But church is not just for me to do what I like. That's not the point of church. So I think one worship also encourages participation. And that means that you have to, within that one worship, it's more challenging, I think, for the worship leaders and designers. Now, the next point about that is that I know within the church growth and redevelopment movement there is something about if there aren't obvious seats available. Now, you've got a big enough sanctuary, right? So you can all be meeting in there, and there's still plenty of room?
For the time being.
For the time being, yeah. But really, there is a critical moment, they say. And I think sometimes I've been in a church where we're at kind of our maximum, and if someone walked in the door, they would say, well, there's really kind of not room for me here. So you've got to watch for that. And that's when you want to move to 2 services, but then I would still encourage doing 2 similar services as opposed to stylistically different services. Because when you focus yourself on the heart of the matter and on this skeleton, what you're going to do is you're going to have more important things to think about than whether or not you're singing Beautiful Savior with the organ in the way I grew up. And you're going to be thinking more about what are the scripture lessons for the day, what is the liturgical season, and within that, as well as, I'd say, the life of the congregation and the life of the world. Now let's design a worship that has that in relationship to the love of God as we see it revealed in Jesus Christ. And then you might be playing the drums for your gathering and Beautiful Savior on the organ after the sermon, and then you might be singing a Taizé chant during the communion, and you might be sent out in a whole new way by lay ministers that are standing at the door doing the dismissal with the whole family and children. So that all of the ways that you want to encourage participation, and some of these, both this addresses some of your choices that you make. Choices then that are based on other issues rather than, if we had a more casual service, wouldn't it attract more people who are uncomfortable in church? Not necessarily. You know, what's really interesting like about those Taizé worship services, you've heard that word before, it's a community in France. Anybody been there? Or have you been to the French one? You've been to a Taizé worship here in town? Or yeah, right. So it sounds kind of old and, you know, just chanty. It's not like an old Lutheran thing because we didn't normally chant repetitive things over and over again. But like in France, if you go to it, it's filled with 30-year-old people, like 1,000 of them at a worship service. And older people, when I went, I was the anomaly. It was very, very few of us. And so I thought, well, this doesn't necessarily mean young people want to hear just pop music in church. So much of that has to do with the outreach and the relationships that you're doing. It's not really the worship itself that's going to just attract or detract people. I think bad worship detracts more people than anything else, and that can be any style, right? If it's just done poorly, or you don't know what you're doing, or you don't feel like you know when to participate, all the things that make worship difficult. So this age question is very hard. I mean, this is a tricky one now. We are looking at a postmodern Christian world. And this, I think, relates to this, because there are some younger people, as you might know, that have been meeting in kind of more of that, what we've called the emerging church, and some of that has been in a sort of a house church expression. And I think that's been so that they can get to the heart of the matter. Somehow, it feels harder for people if they walk into a building like this and need to go through the sanctuary doors and try to fit into something they don't quite understand. It's been harder to get to the heart of the matter, and they felt more comfortable being in a home with some people they know, in a relationship that they have outside of church. And then that's perfectly fine. I mean, it's great. You could do all this in the house as well as in the church. So I think one of our challenges coming into a postmodern Christian era is how to make a building like this, typical for a church, in the suburbs especially, a welcoming home environment. And most of that, in my opinion, has to do with one-on-one relationships. You have to be talking to somebody in your grocery store and your family and your neighborhood about why you are at church and wouldn't you like to come. It doesn't really have to do so much with the style of worship that you do, but the only way I think that this kind of a place is going to look like a welcoming, interesting environment is if we say to people things like, what do you think about Jesus? Do you have any thoughts? Have you read the book The Zealot? Or I don't know, just any kind of way that you can get into an entrance conversation with someone. And then you don't have to tell or preach or teach. You just have to say, if you've got questions about this or are interested, come with me. And let's go to church. So, at Woodlake Lutheran, you might decide to have one service or many, to have an evening small service in this room. That might be like a house church to meet in this room. We've got a nice piano, good light. And have a little service in here that could be more casual and could also be more participatory. You could do a little Lectio Divina and read the scripture like 3 times by 3 different people and just have some silence. And then maybe ask questions. Your worship would be more like, rather than a big sermon, it would be asking questions, speaking to each other. So there's lots of choices. But I think the key is to always just remember the heart of the matter. Let's see. So how do we get to know each other? What's happening with ages? Diane, I was talking to Diane earlier about not having children in worship, and I understand why places like this make that decision, but I think that's to your detriment. I'm sorry, I know it's hard sometimes to concentrate when small children are running around and are loud, but I really think that they have something to teach us. And I found in my setting it only takes about a half a year for a child to accommodate themselves to worship in a way that's helpful for everybody. So children in worship, I am all for it.
I don't think we don't want children in worship. I think we made a decision to have the education and the worship happen because families weren't going to devote
More than 1 hour?
We didn't feel that they were going to devote more time.
There's a spectrum of opinion on it,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I understand that. It has gotten to be less and less time that families and people want to devote to church, period.
Yeah, because they are coming to church.
For part of it.
For part of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry I can't, of course, be the, save you. But that's up to this one. That's up to the Holy Spirit. And I really do want to commend you for all that you're doing. I think you're wonderful. Thank you for asking me to be here, and I'm happy to hang around for a little bit if anybody wants to talk to me one-on-one.
Thank you.
And then off we go. Good luck.
Good job.